Welcome to Think Orphan, the podcast for orphan excellence. Real talk with real people navigating the global orphan crisis.
Welcome back to the Think Orphan podcast. Thanks again for being a part of the conversation. I'm Phil Dark, your host, and with me is my brother, Brandon Stiver, with his Dodgers hat on today, staying faithful despite, yet another crash in the playoffs. So how you doing, man?
That hits a little close to home. And
I figured it would.
Kid you not, I have not worn my hat in a little bit. I was just rooting for the Rangers in the World Series because Corey Seager's on their team, who used to be our shortstop.
Yes.
And I still love Corey Seager. I put on this Dodgers hat today because I was feeling down, and I kid you not, I put it on, and I said to my wife, I'm putting on my Dodgers hat because I'm a loser, which was not good self-talk. Yes. I acknowledge that. I own that.
Yeah, you should.
I love my Dodgers. We're going to get Shohei Ohtani. But that's not the only thing I'm wearing. You see what else I'm wearing? You see this little G right here?
Yes.
That's Generations Home. On the sleeve it says, End the Orphan Crisis.
Okay, there you go.
So we have a listener, shout out to Daniel, who gave me this shirt when we were at CAFO Summit.
Wow.
And Generations Home is a cool organization working in the Philippines. So
awesome. Yes,
I'm wearing my Dodgers hat. Proud, as always. Yeah. Love my Dodgers, love my Lakers. But I'm also wearing this cool shirt from a cool organization in the Philippines. So anyways.
Well, Daniel, I wear a large. So, DM me for my address. There we go.
There you go.
So, anyway, other than that was not expected. I'm fortunately not wearing my Manchester United shirt, so we don't have to talk about that season right now. I am wearing my Folsom soccer shirt. There we go. What's up, video? There you go if you're watching, because we have our tryouts today. So this is in homage to the fact that we are trying out today and starting the high school season. So I'm pretty psyched about that. But what else is going on other than, and I don't want to let that just go. Like, you gotta be not kinder to yourself, Brandon.
I know. I was feeling a little down this morning.
Yeah.
I was, we just got out of a team meeting, which I was leading the devotional for. And it was, my scripture that I was sharing was 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18, which is, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything you do give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. So if you are a listener and you're wondering what the will of God is in your life, it's those things. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything you do give thanks. So we went around, because I was feeling kind of down. I was kind of feeling like a loser, like Clayton Kershaw going, a third of an inning and giving up like 6 runs to start off our playoffs, which is not ideal. But anyways, I was feeling a little down. So we said, hey, let's say what we're thankful for. And I'm thankful for my Dodgers, because even though they break my heart every October, I love them.
Well, you can always go back to the Kirk Gibson highlight back in the day. And,
I was 2 years old.
Yes.
And Kirk Gibson hit that home run off Dennis Eckersley in Game 1 of the World Series. And I don't remember it live, but I've seen it more times than I can.
I do, and it was one of the most amazing sports moments of all time. And I'm not even a Dodger fan, so there you go.
Are you? You're an Angels fan.
No, I'm strangely a Mets fan, because my first coach was on the '69 Mets.
Oh.
And so we played center field, started 3 of the games in the World Series. And so I became a fan back there when I was about 5. And I just stick to my teams. I have random teams. I'm a Dolphins fan, because back then it was Marino and the Marx brothers, Duper and Clayton, before you were born. And I just stick with them. It's the Bulls back with Jordan. That's kind of a given back then. But yeah, other than that, I don't really follow baseball either. So in all honesty, I just knew that the Dodgers crashed out because I'm a sports fan. So,
we got a lot of division champions, only one World Series over the last decade or so.
At least in the playoffs. So that's good. But anyway, so, all right. What we got going on?
This is not a sports talk. This is not sports talk.
This is not. It seems like it is. It seems like it is.
You have another podcast for sports talk. Today we're talking orphan care, and we're actually talking orphan care on top of orphan care today, because I was able to sit down and have a conversation with Dr. Lauren Pinkston, and she's doing great work. She's the president of Kindred Exchange, which is a cool organization. She's lived cross-culturally. She has her PhD from Clemson. She's the real deal. And she also has a podcast.
That's right.
She also, so it's like podcasting in orphan care about podcasting on orphan care. But I was able to have a conversation with Lauren, and you got to hear it, and we'll kind of break it down afterwards.
And she also is a PhD, which, I knew right away when I heard that you were going to be kind of geeking out a little bit. And so you did not disappoint. I will tell you that. I was not able to be on this, and it's probably a better thing because, I'm just a JD. So she has one more letter in that doctorate. So I don't even.
I'm only an MA myself. So,
okay. But you talk like you're a PhD and a JD combined. So that's good. One day it's going to be Reverend Dr. Brandon Stiver. Bishop. Don't forget Bishop.
Yeah. Well, my son is actually named Bishop. So anyways.
There you go.
All right. Well, without further ado, let's hop into this conversation that I was able to have with Lauren. Dr. Lauren Pinkston is great. I don't know. Are you used to hearing Dr. Lauren Pinkston? You probably are. It's been a few years.
I'm married to a medical doctor, so there's funny stories that I could tell you, but for all purposes and means, please call me Lauren today.
Yes, of course. I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I do default to a higher power differential, and it's hard to get your doctorate. So, anyways, Lauren, thank you so much for coming on Think Orphan. How are you doing today?
I am good. It's been a week in our family and sitting in the tension of what it means to love our kids, but I'm not without hope. So it's always good to talk with you, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
Well, you have had a week. You have also had a life. You have lived cross-culturally. You have done quite a bit of research. You are running a business as well. And I shared with our audience a little bit in the intro before this. But before we really kind of hop into this conversation, I would love, can you just introduce yourself to our audience and share, how you became involved in work with vulnerable and marginalized communities and, of course, including orphan and vulnerable kids as well?
Yeah, it's always a hard question to answer. I just left Trader Joe's a little bit ago because we all need chocolate-covered peanut butter cups. The guy at the checkout counter was asking what I do, and it really depends day to day. But I am an academic, so I really try to sit in the tension of what it means to be a person of faith and also a person that values evidence-based research and empirical data. And sometimes that's a tricky place to be in, but a lot of my work focuses in the anti-trafficking space and how human exploitation crosses over into the private sector, because we know that 86% of labor trafficking victims are victimized within the private industry, private business sector. So that's where some of my work exists in researching how survivors of exploitation would define a healing-centered workplace. I did live abroad. I was paid as a missionary, even though we never called ourselves that. I guess the church that supported my family called us that. So being able to work in the vocational ministry space in Southeast Asia for 5 years was wonderful, and solidified my faith in so many ways, watching how the global church responds to crises. That was, I think, probably what saved my faith more than anything. And, as a wife and a mom of 4 kiddos and someone who wants to be a good community member, just always asking myself, where are my blind spots, and where has even research and academia blinded me to the human experience? It's something that I want to be really warm to, and want to sit with a lot of tenderness in spaces. So I think that's always who I've been. So we can dive into more parts of that, but that's who I am.
Well, I know you've heard the show before, so a lot of what you're talking about really weaves in and out of conversations that we're accustomed to having, including the academia, the cross-cultural experience, the working alongside global partners, all of that. One of the cross sections between, that orphan care really is within the trafficking space, which is something that you've certainly developed a lot of expertise in. And we have, seen studies, such as the Lumos study that came out a handful of years ago around orphanage trafficking. We've heard, stories of trafficking around international adoption in places like Guatemala and other places. So we hear and we're aware of kind of this link, and a lot of your work's research and work has centered around that human trafficking, and really, I mean, if you think about human trafficking, or anti-trafficking, I should probably say, has almost kind of become like a trendy field for Christians to kind of get behind, for better or worse, I suppose. Maybe can you just tell us, what is one thing that is probably exaggerated when people talk about trafficking? And maybe what is one thing that is under-recognized?
Oh, I mean, I feel like I spend so much of my time undoing what people tend to understand and believe about human trafficking today. If you just Google those words, you're going to see pictures of mostly white females with handcuffs or with their hands tied. And I have been in this field for over 10 years, and I can only think of one case study that was true. And that particular case study involved a church network of ritualistic abuse. So one that I've personally seen, that this is almost never the case of, and I realize that kidnapping does happen, but those are sensationalized stories that make it to the front of the headlines. And it really negates the rest of the work that's being done in the space of exploitation. And so I would say, kind of undoing the narratives around the movie Taken, around the movie Sound of Freedom, where, really compelling stories are told, especially with lead militaristic or faith characters take the lead. But when we let survivors tell their stories and lead our understanding of what's going on, it's easier to recognize that this is going on in all of our neighborhoods, all over the world. And so to say, to the other point that you asked about, what is less understood is how much our lives are all intertwined with the realities of slavery today. And, I grew up in rural Tennessee. My grandfather was a cotton farmer. And I remember growing up and reading Gone with the Wind and asking my mom, where would we have been if we had been living in the 1800s? Would we have been the plantation owners? I was quite aware of my social location, and I have, through years of learning and peeling back my place in society, realized that I may not be cracking a whip over someone's back today, but I am absolutely contributing to slavery where it exists in the world. So whether that's the cotton fields of India, where men are working with harsh chemicals and have a shorter life expectancy because of the demand that we have for fast fashion, whether that's the chocolate that, we're recording this in October and we're getting ready for Halloween, but, whether that's the Nestle chocolate that we're buying and the children that are wrapped up in that industry, we could go through technology, we could go through cobalt that's involved in our electric vehicles, but all of those industries are rampant with not only human trafficking, but child labor and child exploitation. And unfortunately, a huge part of that is also the orphan crisis. And so thank you for bringing awareness to this, because I know it's a place that we don't want to talk about, especially as churches are driving so much of the engagement with orphanages around the world.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. And I feel as though if we look at supply chains, if we recognize the reality of where are our products coming from, if we start to peel this back, we would find some things that we wouldn't be happy about. And I think because of the history of trafficking, slavery, exploitation in the United States, we have a very simple view of what it is, because we had this very overt form of chattel slavery And now it's not that, oh, well, we got rid of slavery, it's all been abolished, but rather it's just kind of been pushed to these margins where it's not seen as much, but it is seen when we pull our cell phone out of our pocket because of the metals that are in it, or turn on our electric vehicle, as you said, or put on that, new shirt from fill in the blank box store. So that's really, really helpful. And I think it's incumbent on us as consumers to actually look at those things and not look away. I'm wondering, I had heard, it was actually a pastor at the church I was at in Long Beach a while back. Maybe you would know this, but they had gone onto some website that basically they could like fill in their information and then it like kick back like, this is how many slaves you own. Like, does that ring a bell? I'm like just kind of going off. Like, does that ring a bell? I know there's some kind of things that kind of inform us.
Yeah, there's a website called Slavery Footprint, slaveryfootprint.org. And if you forget the website, you can just type in how many slaves work for you. But it's a really cool interactive website. Cool is probably not the right word there, but it allows you to kind of take an assessment, like do an inventory of your own life, your technology, your closet, your pantry, and we'll kick back, like you said, that number of how many slaves do help fund the lifestyle that you are living, and it's a real opportunity, I guess, to engage with the ways that our lives are entwined with the issue.
Yeah, certainly a sobering opportunity, but a necessary one. When we think about trafficking and in work that you were doing in Southeast Asia and research and people that you've partnered with, it's easy to kind of look at it. And even once you start to get into the nuance and the complexity of it, you can start to think like, oh man, this is just totally intractable. Like, what can we honestly do? Like, okay, all right, I won't shop at Old Navy anymore, whatever, like, I think Old Navy's bad. I don't know if they are or not. Please don't come after me, Old Navy.
I'm not going to come after you. I think Old Navy will be fine.
Okay. But, beyond that, understanding the reality and the depth and the complexity of the problem around trafficking, you're also promoting solutions to that. And a lot of it has to do around this freedom business, which is really kind of central to your work and what you guys are doing. Can you just explain to us what's meant by that?
Yeah, sure. So the term freedom business has traditionally meant a business that was formed with the purpose of employing survivors of exploitation. And so traditionally, these have been businesses that will, have 90 to 100% of their employee base coming straight out of a red light district or a brothel type establishment. We are really seeing this movement evolve. And I sit on the board at Freedom Business Alliance, and we really are trying to evolve the movement from within our organization as well to say we are so grateful. Mostly Christian businesses that started in this way came out of the BAM movement, the Business as Mission movement, and we're so grateful for what they've learned. And really, we are seeing that they stand in a really powerful place now to say, this is what we've learned from our years of boots on the ground. This is how we can inform the broader business sector and inform policies at the state level, at the federal level, at the international level of what it means to really bring accountability to our businesses, to inform our workspaces so that people who have a traumatic history can be less triggered in those environments, and can also bring financial literacy to communities that have, collectively forced their fathers and mothers and daughters into a situation of exploitation. And so we have different levels of how we name those freedom businesses now. If you get on freedombusinessalliance.com, you can see our code of excellence that kind of outlines what we want to see moving forward in the sector. But it's exciting to see here, even in the state of Tennessee. I'm sitting in a roundtable with Tennessee Businesses Against Trafficking, saying, okay, we want to bring this awareness to more businesses that can employ larger numbers of people rather than a small to medium enterprise that can only employ 20 to 100 individuals, because the reality is we need a lot more jobs than that.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think it relates to the broader the broader global development space in general, if we look at multinational corporations, we often see that they are huge perpetrators, but they also represent the biggest potential for actually helping communities exit poverty. So it is important, and even what you're saying in terms of the education, that we were just talking about a moment ago, the education for us as consumers that's necessary, but also the education and the awareness that's being raised at the level of the community itself, where people are being pulled and exploited from. So yeah, that's really, really helpful.
I'm glad you brought that up. If I can just, I'm just going to put a pin there for just a second, because so many times I'm thinking about when the Rana Plaza collapsed in 2013 and over 2,000 garment workers lost their lives in a day. They had been reporting a factory that was not stable, was not structurally sound. And they, families found their family members kind of twisted in bolts of fabric and labels that we wear all the time. It was shocking. The UK really led a beautiful movement out of this called Who Made My Clothes? Fashion Revolution was started. But when we see shocking things like that, the immediate response, I think that's natural for us, is to say, shut it down. We're not going to do that anymore. But if we did that, we would see thousands of people, millions of people lose their jobs and their ability to make money for their families. And so while capitalism has its issues and it is not at all perfect, and it is understandably the greatest perpetrator in some of these exploitative jobs, it has also moved the needle for more families than ever before in history to move out of poverty. So we've seen, in the last 2 decades, more families move to the other side of the poverty line because of the amount of jobs that consumerism has created. So it's a both and conversation, and I want to honor that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think within a marketplace economy, there is space for both small, medium, and large businesses, and the main thing that we want to promote is ethics. True ethical practices within each of those, so that people are not taken advantage of and not exploited. So yeah, I really appreciate that. And of course, we all remember that collapse, which was a decade ago now, which is really hard to believe, but just the images. Right now in our news, we're seeing, stuff in conflict in Ukraine, conflict in Israel, and the Gaza Strip. And when we think back to that calamity of 2,000 people dying, it's like, well, that was avoidable though. It wasn't even like conflict. It's just like, no, that was just really poor practice, and not just negligence, because some outright kind of deviant behavior, but it could have been avoided. This wasn't a geopolitical, conflict or anything. So it is important that we look at those entire systems for sure. As we are thinking about Southeast Asia and reflecting on some of that you're talking about in terms of trafficking and poverty and so forth, these issues really intersect a lot with vulnerable children, which is obviously what we talk about here on Think Orphan. Can you maybe share how you've seen those different issues kind of intersect?
Yeah, the first one that I will share is just how much my worldview had to change in order to work effectively alongside the leaders in the country where I was. The framework that we have in the global north around the word freedom is one that we feel often that we hold and that we own, and that everyone else should ascribe to. And so the first pillar of my own thought that I really had to knock down was how I define freedom as being how everyone else should also define freedom. So when I talked to survivors who had come out of the human trafficking space, young women, young adult women, and asked them, what is freedom to you? How do you define freedom? They said, freedom means having a patron. It's someone that will take care of me, somebody that I know I can have a safe place with, and that will foot the bill if my mom gets sick and goes into the hospital. I mean, we have to understand that in much of the world, if you walk into a hospital, you cannot get immediate care. You have to be able to pay up front for the services, be able to pay up front. You are walking across the street to the pharmacy to pay for whatever script the doctor has written. And so that really changes your framework for how you engage with the people in your community. It forces you to rely on the community a lot more, especially in places where there is not the same access to economic stimulus. So, tearing down that idea that I had about freedom and asking better questions to the community to say, okay, what does success look like for you? If I had gone into, I was living in a communist country, if I'd gone into this safe house where I was working and said, and I saw short-term, people coming in doing this before we brought in child protection policies and did not allow short-term people. This was early on in my days of living there and working with the organization. People would come in and say, what do you want to be when you grow up? You can be absolutely anything you want to be. And I wanted to say, time out. No, they can't. They're going to be what their dads tell them they're going to be, and their dads are telling them what they're going to be because of what the government has already decided they are going to allow as far as the quota for medical professionals. And, it's just, I'm not saying that it's wrong or that it's right, but it's a different way of living that really pushes on some of our own definitions that we've made in very sterile environments about what child protection looks like and what family preservation looks like and what communal living looks like. So I'll pause there, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind as saying we have to think differently and ask the community, how are you functioning already? Where do children exist within your community? What's their purpose? How are they valued? And what gaps exist?
At Think Orphan, we are all about creating lasting solutions for children and families. You've heard us talk time and again about how poverty impacts families and literally creates orphans. One of the ways that we can combat poverty and strengthen families is by supporting local enterprise in the Global South and changing our purchasing decisions. That is why I'm so excited to share with you about Sojourn Studio. Sojourn Studio empowers young women and moms on the Thailand-Myanmar border through dignified work as they handcraft beauty to rewrite stories and lift communities. Women earn fair wages, educational scholarships, savings funds, health benefits, and maternity care. Beyond their ethical production and the opportunity to strengthen families, the jewelry itself is truly beautiful. I value fair trade products and have gotten my wife multiple pieces of jewelry from Sojourn Studio. She loves wearing them, and we love knowing that the purchase made a difference for families in Southeast Asia. With Christmas coming up soon, get your loved ones something that they will enjoy and wear with pride. Click the link in our show notes or visit sojournstudio.org to start shopping. You mentioned patronage, which to us is like a dirty word, like we don't think along those lines, and yet in so much of the Global South, it's not a bad thing. It's just a function, like we would say, well, this is a market economy and you got to pull out a loan and you got to, start this thing and you got to, it's just those things that we would just say, oh, that's just benign. That's just what you do. There are multiple things in other cultures and other contexts where that's just what they do. It's not good or bad. It's just, that's what they do. And, even in terms of like some stuff that's just like, wow, that's really bad. And it can go sideways. But even things where it's like nepotism. Nepotism is ubiquitous in the Global South. It's so common. And we look at that and be like, oh, you're giving favors to your family members. And, that can definitely go sideways. And it does in East Africa or wherever. But there's also this component where people hire the people that they trust, and that's kind of how it is. And it's just a fact of life. So it is important that we kind of take some of those things into account, when we are engaging, whether that's, in the business or, helping marginalized communities or what have you. So that's really good. As I kind of think through, those connections, I really, one clear connection to me is really within the field of OVC. That you do touch on a little bit in your dissertation as well is around that short-term missions piece. And our listeners know we've talked about short-terms all the time, and I don't want to belabor that in any ways. But one of the things that you actually discuss is how people have these kind of personal anecdotes, from their short-term, cross-cultural experiences. And those experiences really kind of trump, for lack of a better word, the evidence that is actually coming out in terms of, the downside of that, or the need to kind of reform how we go about those. We kind of just creating this research base, and we'll take it from this country context and that country context and so on. And we'll say, well, look at this, this doesn't work here. We, previous episode to this one, we had Mac Archer on, and this was something we touched on with her as well. We have this research base, and yet it's that positive personal anecdote from somebody else's short-term experience that is kind of trumping all of that. So, if that's the case, and you can tell me if that's not the case, but if it's the case that we have this good research and lots of evidence, but people still default to their own experiences, what's the hope of even having research? I mean, you have a doctorate from Clemson, it's like, what's the hope of even having research and developing these evidence bases if people are just going to be like, well, but I had this personal experience and I had this emotional thing that happened. I mean, what's the hope in as we continue to kind of develop this research?
On my darkest days, I asked myself that same question. I can tie this back to the human trafficking movement as well, because, we've got loads of research and data that shows the push and pull factors that lead someone into an exploitative work situation. And still, I remember sitting in a conference years ago at UNL, and they were saying, I had pulled these women together in the Philippines, and I had a group of women who were sitting there. I showed them all of the research that showed they were all considering moving to Qatar or somewhere in the Gulf states for work. Okay. She said, I showed them all of the research, all of the things that showed why this might be a risky decision. And at the end of that presentation, I said, how many of you still want to go to the Gulf states to work? And every single one of them raised their hand. She pulled in a survivor into the circle who told her story and told the experience that she had while working there. Asked the same question after that narrative was shared in a safe place with a racial and gender mirror that these women could identify with. And at the end of that session, she said, how many of you still want to go to the Gulf states to work? And only 3, I think she said, raised their hand. And I think that nods to the power of story, right? The power of trusted relationships, like you shared. We're no different than anyone in East Africa or anyone in Central America. We all trust people that we know and that we can see ourselves in. And so I think that's why it's so vital that we give people a different frame for how they engage cross-culturally. I started an organization a few years ago called Kindred Exchange with a colleague of mine. And a lot of people ask me, Lauren, why didn't you start an anti-trafficking organization? But the reality is, where I saw the greatest amount of harm being done was also the place that I sat in the faith space, and wanted to provide an alternative for people. We read When Helping Hurts. You've had Brian Fickert on the show several times. He's so lovely. Every time I talk to him, I love him so much. Love his most recent book, maybe the most. But so many people read When Helping Hurts and they just froze, and they said, well, I don't know what to do now. And so at Kindred Exchange, what we're trying to do is to lay out a framework that allows people to still engage cross-culturally, because we do want to be connected, especially in a globalized world that allows us to be connected more than ever. But we want to do that in a way that promotes mutuality, that promotes a shared learning experience, and that says, I might have some things that I could offer someone in Ethiopia, but I believe that the Ethiopian church and the Ethiopian professional network has something that they can offer me as well. And so that's really the work that I've poured myself into outside of the anti-trafficking research, because you're exactly right. Stories are what drive our engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to not pull back. And that might sound odd, because sometimes we do need to pull back. But there is a reality around living in a globalized world where, I mean, we were just talking about, cotton in India and cobalt in Eastern Congo, and, these kind of nefarious actors are using all of these global chains. These people are connected to those people through this product. We need to be doing the same, but in a way that is gospel-centered, altruistic, actually wanting the best for people, not seeking to exploit. And look, that can go sideways. And that was a big part, obviously, of Brian's book, Brian and Steve Corbett's book. So we know that it can go sideways. That should be reason for us to better equip. And that's good that's what Kindred Exchange is doing. And obviously we've seen this within the orphan care space as well, both the nefarious actors that are exploiting children, and at the same time, people with good intentions that are just doing it poorly. And then plenty of people, but not enough people, that are engaging within the orphan care space and actually doing good and actually helping kids get back into family, helping kids get their basic needs and rights met. And that's good. And we need more of that. And we want to shut down those that are being nefarious, and we want to convert those that have good intention but poor practice. And that's something that you are currently exploring within your own podcast. So, I think our audience understands at this point that podcasting is something that I love. When Phil invited me to take over the show 2.5 years ago, it has been a blessing. It has been so much fun. I get to have great conversations like I am right now with you, Lauren. And so this is just cool because not too long ago, you and I had connected. You know my wife from when both of our families were living overseas. You guys connected online, which was cool. And I saw you releasing. I was like, who's this Lauren Pinkston? And then I was like, Missy, do you know this person? And then she's like, yeah, I know Lauren. We Skype sometimes or whatever. So it was just like, oh, okay, well, she's got this podcast coming out and she's having like our friends on there, like Brian Ficker and Craig Greenfield and, all these people that we know and love. And this is just cool. So you guys went through your first season, which released earlier this year. And you guys, when this is released, you guys will be in the process of releasing your second season. And you guys decided to focus on orphan care, which is really, really cool. So I would love to just kind of hear, with you guys releasing the second season of the Upwardly Dependent podcast, what is it that drew you to looking at orphan care as kind of your primary theme?
I think it was so many adoptive families reaching out and saying, can we talk about this? Either they were saying, I didn't know what I was getting into, and I'm not changing my mind about it, but I just didn't know what I was getting into. Or, just saying, I would love to sit in solidarity with people who care about this issue. I am an adoptive mom, and I adopted from Uganda. I say that with a lot of reservation because in this space, we've learned so much over the years. I can say that when I flew to Uganda in 2016, I was living in Southeast Asia, and I fully intended to get back on that plane with only my bio child that I had at the time and my husband, because I was so concerned about the state of the orphanage movement in Uganda and how ridden it was with children who had been trafficked into Christian families who just had no idea that this was going on. We had been in the process for a long time, and I was incredibly skeptical. And until I met our lawyer face to face, and until I engaged with our daughter's story, and felt fully confident that every stone had been turned in her story and an ability to try and reconnect her with any living relatives at all, which we were not able to find, did we decide to move forward. And so I don't know that we would ever go forward with an international adoption at this point, knowing what we know and learning what we've learned. But because of all of that, I feel like I have a responsibility to sit responsibly a responsibility to sit in that space, and share, what we do know now, as far as best practices, and to say, look, we're not pointing fingers at people. We're not asking everyone to shut down and fail to engage in this space, especially globally. But we are asking everyone to listen to the stories of adult adoptees. We are asking churches to say, how are our dollars collectively driving a massive movement that we may think is isolated to our town in rural Alabama or Indiana, but truthfully, all the numbers combined are telling a story, and are driving the issue within the North American church more than anything in the world. I think the North American church is the most significant actor in the field of global orphanages. So, you'll hear in my trailer for this season that this is the most nervous I have ever been to put content out into the world. We have expanded to so many conversations that deal with international trafficking of children, but also infertility and IVF and global policies around child protection, things that are so attachment issues, and the U.S. criminal justice system and child trauma. I mean, like, so many tender conversations that people are very divided on and have polarized thoughts about. And so I'm an Enneagram 8. A lot of things don't scare me, but releasing this season is really, it has been it's been a labor for me to make sure we're having these conversations carefully. And I can't thank you enough for taking a call with me and being willing to help inform this season and inform the voices that we've brought on, make the connections. When I decided to go this route, I knew that you were the first person that I needed to talk with. And I have just been really grateful for your willingness to guide me and mentor me through this process.
Oh, well, that's unwarranted. Thank you, though.
I know you're asking for that, but I've just so enjoyed your podcast. I've followed your work and your research for years, Brandon, before I ever reached out, and so I'm really.
Thank you, Lauren, and our listeners. You guys will find yourselves in good company when you plug into Upwardly Dependent, because, not only did they have like Brian and Craig on in last season, but this season they're having Jed. There were a number of people that I had sent. Hopefully they all said yes, but I think Brett Phillips is going to be on there. Hopefully he's like, honestly, like my favorite person, one of my favorite people in all of orphan care. Like a lot of the people that undoubtedly, who else?
Kimberly Quinley that you had on recently.
Wow. Kimberly, she's like the godmother of family care, and she's a friend of yours. You know her better than I do, and she's just awesome.
I almost birthed a baby in her car, not on purpose, but we lived with her and her husband in Thailand when my third kiddo was born. So,
and yeah, she's awesome. So a lot of people that you guys have heard on Think Orphan are going to be on Upwardly Dependent as well. So undoubtedly, you guys hear somebody like Jed or Kimberly speak, and you're like, "Oh, I want to dig in further." That's why you guys should check out Upwardly Dependent, because you're gonna hear Lauren dive into these conversations and also talk with a bumbling Brandon Stiver in one of the episodes. But it's been it's been awesome to kind of see the direction. And here's the thing, it just for people that are not aware, in podcasting spheres, sometimes people are like, "Oh, I don't want to reference another podcast because then I'm like dividing my own listenership and yada, yada, yada." Okay, that's so like backwards way of looking at this. Holy smokes. If there's anything you guys have heard on Think Orphan, it's that we need more conversations around ethical orphan care, family-based care. And Lauren, you handle those topics very well. So just as a personal plug, if you're hearing this, please definitely check out Upwardly Dependent as well. And Lauren, I would love to even just kind of hear, as you have been having some of these interviews. I think you mentioned before we got on that you were talking just with Jed yesterday, in the midst of all your podcast interviews. And obviously, as you mentioned, you're an adoptive parent, you live cross-culturally, so you have a lot of firsthand experience. But you're also interviewing some people with varied experiences and entering into conversations where they have tremendous expertise. I mean, what have been some of the things that you've learned that even you didn't know before you started having these conversations with all these different individuals?
Yeah, I'm like you. I love podcasting because I get to talk with people who are smarter than me all the time, and it's so fun to hear and to learn and pick up little pieces of wisdom from them. One thing that you laid out in the very first episode that will drop in our season is just how to have a framework. I keep using that word today, but how to define the difference between family preservation and child protection. And until I listened to you, I had not really put that together of how different states will lean heavily into one realm or the other with their policy and with their services that they offer to children and to families. And, you're in the Pacific Northwest, I'm in Tennessee, and the way that we access resources for our own kids is so vastly different because of the ways our states have decided to address the protection of children. So I think that that's very fascinating. It was very helpful for me. I will also say that, listening to people and bringing on guests from outside of the Christian space to share their perception of how the church is engaging with this issue, I think is critical for us to have the courage to listen to those voices as well. And I'll be recording in the next couple of weeks around the U.S. justice system and how we make sure we are allowing children with traumatic experiences to guide our policies, that our prisons don't become places of, we're just locking folks away, but they could potentially even be places of rehabilitation. And I would love to see a shift towards that. I'll have Centoya Brown Long on, who, spent years, she came out of foster care and adoption and spent 16 years in prison before she was able to earn her freedom by really advocating for herself. She's a dear friend. She's absolutely phenomenal. And she's working with prisons right now to say, look, this is really an area where you need to improve. So those are some of the conversations that I'm really grateful that I've been able to have.
Okay. Well, what you're sharing, what was the woman's name?
Centoya Brown Long.
Centoya Brown. Okay. So that is really fascinating to me and something I want to hear about. I'll just kind of say, because a few things. The foster care to prison pipeline is real. It is absolutely real. And it is also true that when we condition people to be living in alternative care, or we condition them to be living in residential care, it's not inevitable, but it is incredibly common that when they exit care as children and as youth, they will end back up in residential models, including prison.
That's right.
So if we don't start to disrupt that whole process, we could not just see, we talk all the time on Think Orphan about the importance of kids reunifying, getting back into their families, back into their communities. And we're talking about children and youth, right? So we're talking about minors. Well, the reality is it's not good for adults to be wasting away in institutionalized care either. But unfortunately, if we don't reach them in their childhood adversity with effective means of intervention and strengthening, then they're just either going to, their life will flame out because they will be subject to violence, or their life will flame out because they'll brush up against something and end up in prison. And I don't say that to be overly cynical or what have you. It is just a harsh reality.
It's so true. It's so true. And, I know you guys have talked about ACE scores on here a lot, but those adverse child experiences play into a brain that is wired for fight or flight. It manifests as PTSD in our kids who live in constant dysregulation because they're trying to protect themselves because they have not had a safe environment to be in. And when that fear kicks in, or that lack of safety kicks in, our neuro cells take over, our brains take over our bodies. And so we've tried to talk with kids, even talk with people who are interacting with our law enforcement in a way that uses logical linear thought, not accounting for the realities of how brains are impacted by trauma. And so and I want to say too, this intersects with the human trafficking field, because we know that up to 80% of human trafficking victims in the United States, in some states, are coming straight from the foster care system. And so there's a direct pipeline of foster kids being brought into situations of human trafficking, who are then pulled into criminal activities by their perpetrators. And our response to that, all of those adverse childhood experiences, is to put these kids in prison, to put these women in prison, and then make it impossible for them to ever stand on their own 2 feet financially, because they have loads of debt, they have criminal records, and they can't get access to any type of funding or credit card to get a job, to do anything. And so we're pumping millions of dollars into a criminal justice system that is benefiting from our refusal to rehabilitate the kids in our communities. I watched last week, our governor broke ground on a $450 million police training academy in Tennessee. At the same time, I am fighting for any funding to be able to pay for the therapeutic services that we need as a family to keep our family together and intact. Right. That is a backwards way of thinking about it. And if we are, as people of faith, going to stick whatever we stick in the ground, put
our stake in the ground.
We're going to put our stake in the ground over anything. Let it be for kids. Let it be for the rehabilitation of families, and let it be for just a dogmatic support of people with childhood experiences that are adverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad. I mean, guys, if that isn't a promo for checking out Lauren's podcast, I don't know what is, because I feel as though that criminal justice piece is so pertinent to this conversation, and not necessarily something that we've tackled too much here on Think Orphan. So really important that we think about this. And holy smokes, I mean, we are talking about large-scale systems that are always intertwined, that are always intersecting. And if we are not taking into account the trafficking piece, the social enterprise piece, the criminal justice piece, if we're not taking into account all of these other areas, then new gaps will emerge, or they're already there and we're just neglecting to even acknowledge them. And so I really appreciate that piece. And wow, I'm excited for the season. I believe it will be dropping in November. This episode of Think Orphan will also be dropping in November. So definitely make sure that you guys make your way over to check out the Upwardly Dependent podcast. All right, before we go, though, we do have a couple questions that we ask everybody, and probably given your own recent foray into podcasting around orphan care, but also your own background as a parent and as an academic, I'm sure you're going to give us awesome responses and resources that we can put in our own show notes. So, Lauren, what have you read, watched, or listened to that has most impacted your thinking on how we can love orphan and vulnerable children with families with excellence?
So many. I really, really appreciate the work of Hillary McBride. And she talks about, her most recent book, The Wisdom of Your Body. I'm so grateful for people who have poured themselves into that work of understanding how our bodies manifest, or how trauma manifests in our bodies. And so Hillary has been a great resource for me. And as a parent, there's another book that I've pulled in for my kiddos that she recommended called Bodies Are Awesome, I think. And it's just like such an inclusive book. It's brought so many great conversations to my kids, but I love Hillary McBride's work around the body and trauma.
Okay, that's really good. And I feel as though that's the second time. If I'm remembering correctly, I think Tiffany Bloom also mentioned Hillary McBride. So I think that
I love Tiffany
means...
too.
Oh, it's a friend. She's a friend. She goes to the same church as me.
Well, I have her book on my shelf also.
Yeah, that's a really good book. Okay, all right. So Hillary McBride has come up twice now. I'm going to have to... Man, I have so many books that I have bought and yet to read, but I'm going to have to add that one. All right. What person has most impacted your thinking on how we can love orphan and vulnerable kids with excellence?
Well, we talked about Kim Quinley earlier, so I have to give her a nod because sitting around her dinner table while we were kind of camped out in Thailand waiting on my kiddo to be born was huge in the way that she just brought such great evidence into our conversations, and watching how they transformed step ahead to really adjust their programming. Another person that comes to mind is Angela Tucker. And as an adult adoptee, the way she talks about transracial adoption, and I'll plug for her book as well that she just came out with. I'm excited to dive into that this week, but she's a great leader in this space, and I have her artwork on the wall of my adopted daughter's room. And I know that you asked me for one, but I'm going to give you one more. Shannon Martin. I just really appreciate the way that she has grown her family, protected her family, cared for her family through a number of ways. But her 4 kids all came to her through different situations, and her husband works in the prison system as well. He actually in their local jail. And so I have her on my podcast, but I just really appreciate her writing and how to live as a neighbor.
Okay, lots to follow up with. So listeners, don't just follow up with the recommendations, but follow up with my recommendation, which is to go check out Upwardly Dependent to dive into more of these conversations, including with Shannon, who you just mentioned, and Miss Brown something that was doing the criminal justice, and lots of friends that have been on Think Orphan. I mean, it's going to be a great season. I'm looking forward to it. And Dr. Lauren Pinkston, thank you so much for joining us on Think Orphan. It was a delight to have you.
Thank you, Brandon. So appreciate you and all the work you do in the space.
Well, Lauren, such a good opportunity to talk with her about not just orphan care, not just podcasting, but really diving into her expertise. You know, Phil, when you started Think Orphan, a lot of it was really kind of looking at the intersections. You know, orphan care isn't just orphan care, you know, and that's why we talk with people like Peter Greer, you know, Brian Ficker, these people that are coming from like economic development or transformational development or human trafficking, like we were able to talk with Lauren today. You know, there are all of these cross sections. So just really appreciated her expertise and the opportunity to kind of dive into some big topics with her. What did you think, man, as you got a chance to listen to my conversation with Lauren?
Yeah, you know, I love getting people on who, and she didn't necessarily overtly talk about the interconnectedness, but she did talk about the interconnectedness. And for those of you who listen to this podcast, for those of you who read In Pursuit of Orphan Excellence, you know that how I got involved in this originally was by reading books by Gary Haugen on anti-trafficking work back in 2004, before a lot of people were talking about it. And I remember Not For Sale campaign with David Batstone back in the day. Like that was 2005. He wrote Not For Sale. And I started without knowing what I was seeing. I was seeing the interconnectedness because I saw that a lot of the victims were orphan and vulnerable children, families that were desperate, poverty-ridden, you know, broken families, or broken fathers who are putting their kids into slavery because they need to pay for their TV or their rent or whatever. And as I started learning more and more and more and visiting some of these places, and I remember visiting Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and talking with Craig Greenfield about it back in the day. We mentioned Craig Greenfield in the interview, and learning about different things, talking with AIM and the stuff they're doing there in Phnom Penh. And then going back a few years later, and actually a friend of mine was working with one of the safe houses, and I actually sat across the table from 2 young women who were literally rescued 3 days before that. Now, was that best practice to have me at a table with them in a cafe? Probably not. But what it did for me was really saw the brokenness at its, like, we don't see that level of despair normally. I don't care how long you've been doing this work, you don't normally see that unless this is the work you do. And what you learn of these women is a lot of them, you know, they have no idea what to do because they're caught between 2 worlds where so many times the reason they are in the prostitution, it's not even trafficking. Because trafficking is when you are pulled out and you are moved, the movement of persons, right? And what you find is the dad put their child or encourage their child to go into the prostitution to help the family, quote unquote. So when you rescue a child out of that and you say, we need to take you out of this, they are torn because they're like, I need to help my daddy. I need to help my family. And my response to that ceases to be a father when you put your kid into that, right? Like, so, right. But that yet they're so desperate that where does that stop? Sometimes that there is evil there. Sometimes there is that utter desperation that, again, as I said, we don't see that level of despair. We don't see that level of desperation. We don't see those things. But then we look at this stuff, when you sit there across the table for someone, it becomes so real. And I can tell Lauren's seen these different things, and to be able to really understand that while there is such a massive issue and so many massive things going on, there's so many moving parts to it. And we only, no matter how much we see, we only see a little bit of it, right? When you're in Tanzania, you saw that. Now that you're with 1 Million Home, you're seeing a bigger picture, but it's still not, everywhere. And so when someone comes to you from Chile and says, we got this issue, you can only partially know it, right? And so that's where, as she says these different things, and you're saying, what is, even when you're talking about Sound of Freedom, Taken, as she's talking about those as, are they untrue? Well, Taken, of course, that's different. But Sound of Freedom is based on a true story. Of course, it's actually happened. Was it sensationalized a bit for Hollywood? Sure. But, and there are things that I saw that I was like when the girls are playing games right after being rescued, I'm like, okay, that's not going to happen. They're going to be in such trauma right, that it's going to be a whole different animal. But there is still truth. It's not like we throw the baby out with the bathwater and go, that doesn't happen, because it does. There are those mass rescues like that, but it is the exception to the rule, which does happen. And so for somebody to go, oh yeah, I know how to fight trafficking, I saw Sound of Freedom. No, that's not the thing. But what I hope Sound of Freedom does, it gets people thinking about these things. It gets people wanting to do, wanting to get involved at some level. So I don't want to, say, oh, it's bad to do those things. I just think we need to have great follow-on conversations with people to be able to say, okay, it's so much bigger.
Yeah,
it's so much more serious. Yeah.
And we need and we need to be holistic, and we need to consider all the different components. So when we talk about, those individuals that are placing their own children at risk, like you were saying, a moment ago, do we look at preventative types of things and say, that's also anti-trafficking work, that's also orphan care, that's also,
That's right.
Because unfortunately we do have, and even, I haven't seen Sound of Freedom, and I don't know that guy's story, and undoubtedly once Hollywood gets a hold of something, things get embellished pretty much automatically. So I'm sure that there was that was happening, but that is one slice of it that gets sensationalized, and that's what people go to, and they want to hear that story. Do we have an appetite to hear, hey, this kid was never trafficked because
That's right,
their church or their organization or their family did this thing that helped them not be put at risk? Do we have an appetite for those types of stories, or are they too boring, kind of thing? And unfortunately, there are organizations that build their whole, media communications all around this really kind of like sensational version of it. Whereas, sometimes the work of family care, sometimes the work of community strengthening, sometimes it's not like boring or mundane, but it's just very typical, but like that's actually the work that is keeping families together, preventing trafficking, preventing family separation. Like, I hope that we can look at those types of organizations, and these are the types of organizations, our episode after this, we're going to be doing an on-the-ground episode with Salamta Family Project. And, that's an organization that is providing homes, in the community, alternative family care. And that's just kind of day in, day out, it's life, but it's not always like this sensational thing. And yet those are the types of organizations that we should be getting behind. So anyways, so much good stuff there from Lauren, and super appreciate her expertise. Anything else stick out to you, man?
Well, we started this episode by talking about sports. So I just thought one of the sports analogies I always use is defense. Usually defense does not get the acclaim, does not get the press, does not get the all-star. They might get all-stars because you have to have defenders, but you're not getting the MVP of the league typically because of your Golden Glove performance, to go to baseball, or the fact that you had tons of shutouts and you were the center back on your team. Like, you really don't get that. That's not who's getting there. I've seen a defender up for the Ballon d'Or, which is the world's global football's best player of the year. I think it was Virgil van Dijk may have been the last one. It was a long time ago, and they usually don't win. They might be up, but it's kind of like the Heisman. Defenders, Charles Woodson was up, and it was like, oh, that was always like a debate, right? Like, why are they even up? Monte Teo was there, right, as a possible. So it's so rare, like, we remember them. Right. And now I see that as preventative work is the defense. As defending against these things. It doesn't get the press. Oftentimes it's boring. Oftentimes, you're not going to get, this pizzazz coming out of it. It's just day to day in the trenches, getting the work done, doing work that is making all the difference in the world. As they say, offense wins games, defense wins championships, right? The consistency of that defense. The offense can go out and do a raid, and I don't want to get mad at it because you need both, right? We need both. But I remember when they were talking like the war on terror back in the day, and they're like, oh, education's the answer. And other people are like, no, we need to go in and take care of it right now. And I'm like, no, we need both. We can't let the guys go out and just bomb everyone. And we need to educate. So that's where I look at it now. And that's why we started this podcast. Why we keep doing it is because these issues are not a simple thing. If it was, we would have had it figured out a long time ago. We need both. We need each other. We need everyone working on the same page. That's why it cannot be a competition amongst us. We can't be mad at people for doing the work that is that sensational work. Like, I don't want to go in, and I remember talking to Don Brewster with AIM, and he went through the slums of Phnom Penh and with a guy doing investigations. I'm like, I don't want to do that. Is that sensational? Yeah, that's crazy. And does that raise money easier? Yes. But I also don't want to do it. And it is needed because there are girls in bondage and in prison. So those are things that I am a big, big, big advocate of. Hey guys, let's cheer each other on. Let's get excited about each other's work. Because chances are the work you're doing that you love, somebody else doesn't love it, and vice versa. But it all needs to be done. So anyway, that's my thoughts.
Well, that's good, man, and good things for us to consider, And I like the defense, thing there, because I'm a right fullback myself. You're a goalkeeper. You know how it is. I'm more of a Sergio Ramos than a Cristiano Ronaldo, even though Ronaldo was always my favorite player. But we'll leave it at that. And great episode, Phil. Why don't you take us out? But last thing, go check out Upwardly Dependent as well, as you guys have been listening to Think Orphan. But yeah, Phil.
I heard there's a dude who was the first episode, or one of the first episodes of season 2, who's got a sweet beard that was on that show too. So definitely check that one out as well. All right, folks. Well, thanks again for being a part of this. We do hope and pray that you take everything you're learning from this show and you use it to help you love orphan and vulnerable children and families better and better each and every day. Thanks a lot. Have a great couple weeks.
We hope you've enjoyed today's Think Orphan podcast. For all the information in this week's podcast, please visit us at thinkorphan.com. You too can be part of the conversation. Send your questions to info@thinkorphan.com or join us on the Think Orphan Facebook page. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again on the next edition of Think Orphan.